Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving deep into two massive developments that happened almost simultaneously just yesterday on December 19, 2025, and they are shaking up the entire landscape of the Russia-Ukraine war as we head into the new year. First, we have Russian President Vladimir Putin holding his annual marathon year-end press conference in Moscow, where he made some really bold and defiant statements about the war in Ukraine. And then, literally hours later, EU leaders wrapping up their summit in Brussels with a huge financial commitment to Kyiv. So let's unpack this step by step, because these events are interconnected in ways that reveal a lot about where this conflict is heading. Now, Putin has been doing these big year-end events for decades. It's a tradition where he takes questions from journalists and ordinary Russians for hours on end, and this one lasted over 4 hours as usual. But the focus, especially from international reporters, was squarely on Ukraine. And when NBC's Keir Simmons directly asked him if Russia would bear responsibility for continued loss of life if peace talks fail, Putin looked straight at him and said, "No, we do not consider ourselves responsible for the loss of life because it was not us who started this war." He went on to frame the whole thing as something that began back in 2014 with what he calls an unconstitutional coup in Kyiv, followed by hostilities against people in Donbass, and that Russia's actions since 2022 are just a response to that narrative. Of course, this is the standard Kremlin line, but hearing it reiterated so firmly at this moment, when there are active behind-the-scenes efforts to negotiate some kind of settlement, it lands differently. Putin also said Russia is ready for negotiations and to end the conflict peacefully, but only if the root causes are addressed, which everyone knows means things like no NATO expansion, Ukraine neutrality, and recognition of Russia's claims over annexed territories. He even praised Donald Trump's team for their sincere efforts to broker peace, but made it clear that the ball is in Ukraine's court, and that delaying talks only worsens Kyiv's position on the battlefield. He boasted that Russian forces have the strategic initiative now and are advancing in multiple directions, predicting more gains before the end of the year. And when pressed on whether there would be more special military operations beyond Ukraine, he said no, as long as the West treats Russia with respect. It's classic Putin, mixing openness to talks with unyielding red lines and a heavy dose of grievance against the West for supposedly deceiving Russia after the Cold War. Now, flipping to the other side of this story, just as Putin was wrapping up his conference, EU leaders were burning the midnight oil in Brussels, and they finally agreed on a massive support package for Ukraine, a €90 billion loan, that's about $105 billion, interest-free, to cover Ukraine's military and budget needs for 2026 and 2027. This is huge, because without it, Ukraine was staring at a serious cash crunch as early as spring next year that could have forced drastic cuts in defense spending or even social payments. The loan is backed by the EU budget, meaning member states are collectively guaranteeing it, and crucially, Ukraine only has to repay it once Russia pays war reparations. If that never happens, the EU has reserved the right to use immobilized Russian assets to cover it. But here's the key twist. They couldn't agree on directly tapping those frozen Russian central bank assets right now for the loan itself. There was a big push, especially from Germany, to create this reparations loan mechanism using the roughly €210 billion of Russian money, mostly held in Belgium. But Belgium wanted ironclad guarantees against any legal backlash from Moscow, and some other countries like Hungary and Slovakia were skeptical. So in the end, they went with Plan B, joint EU borrowing on capital markets. It's still a massive show of unity and solidarity. Ukrainian President Zelensky immediately thanked the EU, calling it a vital reinforcement that strengthens Kyiv's resilience and sends a clear signal to Moscow that Ukraine won't collapse financially. Putin, for his part, called the failed attempt to use Russian assets daylight robbery and said Europe backed off because they feared grave consequences for investor confidence in the euro. Now, let's talk about the reactions, because they are telling. In Russia, state media played up Putin's confidence, portraying him as strong and in control. Ordinary Russians ask about everyday issues, but the war loomed large, with some expressing fatigue, but many buying into the narrative that Russia is defending itself in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there was outrage over any suggestion that Moscow bears blame for the deaths on the Ukrainian side. It's heartbreak and anger, with people seeing this loan as proof that the West is determined to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Zelensky framed the EU decision as proof of European resolve and a blow to Putin's hopes of outlasting Western support. European leaders like Chancellor Friedrich Merz called it a decisive message that Putin's war won't pay off, while others emphasized that keeping Russian assets frozen indefinitely maintains pressure on Moscow. Globally, this timing is no coincidence. Putin's defiance comes as Trump is pushing hard for a quick deal, and there's talk of US envoys meeting Russian officials. The EU stepping up with this loan weakens any argument that Ukraine is desperate and must concede territory or neutrality right away. It buys Kyiv time to keep fighting or to negotiate from a relative strength. But there are hidden angles here. The war is entering its 4th year. Casualties are staggering on both sides. Economies are strained. Russia claims battlefield momentum, but at huge cost. Ukraine is holding, but relying heavily on Western aid. And there's growing war fatigue in parts of Europe, and questions about how long the US will stay fully committed under the new administration. Looking ahead into 2026, this dual message, Putin saying we're not backing down, we're advancing and ready for peace only on our terms, while the EU says we're in this for the long haul financially, could set the stage for prolonged stalemate, or force real negotiations if Trump manages to bring both sides to the table. But if talks collapse, we could see escalation, more Russian advances, deeper strikes, or even shifts in Western weapon supplies. The global impact is profound. Energy prices, security in Europe, refugee flows,
flows all tied to this, and the precedent of freezing and potentially using sovereign assets could reshape international finance for decades. So there you have it. Two leaders, two very different messages, but both signaling that this war is far from over, and 2026 could be pivotal. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, drop a like, subscribe for more updates on the Russia-Ukraine war, and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Peace, everyone.